Σεβασμιότατοι, αγαπητές.
Your Eminences, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is our last session of this very interesting international conference. Our last panel now. We will have two presentations by Mr. Alexander Verkhovsky, and the second one will be by the Director of the Academy for Theological Studies, Mr. Kalaididis, who is on his way. Mr. Verkhovsky was born in 1962, and in 1984 he received his master's degree in applied mathematics from the Moscow Oil and Gas Institute. In 1989 he became the editor of the independent newspaper Panorama. Between 1992 and 1993 he was the director of the Panorama Center, and since 2002 he is the director of the SOVA Information and Analysis Center. His research interests include political extremism, xenophobia, the relation between religion and politics, and especially in contemporary Russia. He has published a number of books. I will just mention a few. Political Orthodoxy, which was published in Russian, and a number of other publications. For example, Nationalism among the Russian Church in the 20th and 21st century, and a number of other publications. The subject of his presentation today is political orthodoxy, religion's involvement in identity for the...
Thank you. Thank you. Your Eminences, dear ladies and gentlemen, I have to thank organizers who invite me here, as I am not a theologian, and as you heard, I cannot be maybe called academician too. I am head of a monitoring center in Russia. But anyway, I will talk about the current events related to Russian Orthodox Church and relationship between church and nationalism. Not about all aspects of this big problem, but only about some of them. The arrival of Patriarch Kirill triggered a major increase in activity of the Russian Orthodox Church. This paper covers only one among many possible consequences of the increase of the church activity. Specifically, I would like to explore its possible effect on the church identity. When I say church in this paper, I mean always Russian Orthodox Church, not a church in general. The church's self-evident main goal is desecularization of the society. However, we have to keep in mind that the church's actions are aimed at partial return to the pre-secular state, which existed in Russia before the revolution. The church is ready to fight for this goal far beyond the church fence. These actions became systematic following the adoption in 2000 of the programmatic document of non-ecclesiastical issues, the basis of the social concept of the Russian Orthodox Church. In particular, Metropolitan and now Patriarch Kirill has developed the bona fide church doctrine of Russian nationalism that really merits attention. Below, I will briefly articulate what could be described as what I call the Kirill's doctrine. In my opinion, the current political ideology of the Russian Orthodox Church should carry his name. It is not just the content of this nationalist doctrine that is important, but also the manner in which the appeal is made, as well as the target audience envisioned by the current church leaders. As any other organization, the church, in its attempt to change the surrounding environment, ends up changing itself as well. These changes depend on social groups that become more or less central for the organization, as well as on ideas and vocabulary that are used most often. And this becomes identifying features of the organization. This paper makes no attempt to predict changes within and around the Church, Russian Orthodox Church, as a result of the current burst of activity by Patriarch Kirill and his supporters. Even criteria for evaluating these changes are currently far from being clear and require further research and development. The goal of this paper is not to describe the Church policy, which was accomplished by many previous authors, but rather to point out this policy less obvious consequences for the role and image of the Russian Orthodox Church itself. Here we need to insert a brief digression in order to discuss Russian nationalism per se, since the Kirill's doctrine is aimed not at the Church insiders, but specifically at current outsiders. The ideological and organizational development of Russian nationalism over the past 2 decades has led in recent years to an increasingly clear-cut opposition between two dominant trends, which can be described as so-called civilizational nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Supporters of the civilizational nationalism gravitate to the imperial image of Russia, conceived as an ideocracy and autocracy. They define Russianness primarily via ideology and the state, and only partially through culture, and believe that the historical path of Russia is completely without parallels because of its unique mission. Supporters of ethnic nationalism, on the contrary, envision a nation-state similar to the ones that proliferated in Eastern Europe between 2 world wars. They view Russia as the best among equals and determine Russianness sometimes by culture and very often simply by blood. Against this background, we need to review the core message of repeatedly articulated official church concept that describes mutual relations of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian state, Russian citizens, and Russians as an ethnic group. According to this concept, the world consists of civilizations defined by their religions. Russia is the core and the natural leader of the Orthodox civilization. Both the Russians as a political nation and ethnic Russians can be called, I quote, an Orthodox people, or, another quotation, a single community of faith, since each group is characterized by the Orthodox majority. The nation has no other values besides the Orthodox ones, and the Russians, both as a political nation or as an ethnic community, were created by Orthodox Christianity. This view puts the Church in a natural position of a national leader. However, this particular conclusion is never emphasized, presumably because the authorities find it absolutely unacceptable. If the Orthodox people denotes both ethnic and political nation, then everyone who belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church should be considered Russian. However, to belong is a problematic term here. The same is true for any mass religion in modern society, according to Grace Davy. Through the post-Soviet years, the number of Orthodox Christians in Russia was hotly debated, and the interest in this issue has been far from purely academic. Patriarch Kirill, however, subscribes to a much broader definition of the Russian identity. Being Russian doesn't require formal church membership via baptism, since the influence of cultural tradition generated by the Church is thought to be sufficient. The Patriarch used the term involvement, причастность in Russian, to denote this concept. In addition to this word literal meaning, the allusion to the similar sounding word причастие, sacrament, is also important. Apparently, what we have here is an inclusive model of ethnocultural nationalism. The Russian culture is defined as involvement in Orthodox Christianity. This is likely the most inclusive existing model of Russian nationalism. In addition, representatives of other religions who are willing to accept the Russian or Orthodox hegemony are included as, let's say, younger brothers within the same Orthodox civilization. James Warhol has coined a felicitous term, hegemonic ecumenism. The Church, however, does not limit itself to simply presenting the model of ethnocultural nationalism, albeit with an unusually broad case. Quite significantly, the subject of the discourse is not merely the nation, but the entire civilization. It is also important that the Russian Orthodox Church is practically the last remaining structure of the imperial scale of the former Soviet Union. Its call for mobilization is openly ideocratic in character. despite the fact that the Orthodox civilization as a concept is explicitly centered around Russia, not around Jerusalem or Mount Athos, it still opposes the secular West in a global struggle. An additional significant implication of such position is its confrontation with the post-Soviet liberal secularism inside Russia. The latter is the most formidable present-day enemy of the Russian Orthodox Church on its own canonical territory, what is Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Accordingly, liberal civic and political values are either questioned or rejected outright, and the civic nationalism is rejected also. Within the framework of civilizational nationalism, a nation is defined by its mission. Thus, the issue of who is Russian and who is not can't be reduced to cultural identification alone. Archpriest Vsevolod Chaplin, currently the head of the Synodal Department of the Church-Society Relations, wrote on several occasions that religious minorities, including atheists, are tolerated within the civil single community of faith, it's a quotation from the Basics, but are, I quote, excluded from its core social and mystical missions. Thus, rethinking the current policy and strategy development in the spirit of civilizational nationalism, the Church openly struggles not just for an increased level of Orthodox piety, but also for change in the Russian citizen's identity. The ideas of Patriarch Kirill represent not just a possible version, but one of the most powerful options within civilizational nationalism. The approach of the Church leadership has interesting political implications, only some of which will be discussed below. In general, the Church, building on the concept of hegemonic ecumenism, promotes ideas which the Church itself perceived as traditional within Russian political and social system. The focus is not just on moral conservatism or limitations on activities of some religious minorities. The Church also supports an anti-Western foreign policy and a shift from formal democracy to a certain specific form of authoritarian rule. It's also important that through the statement of its leaders, the Church takes a certain position in the debates within Russian nationalism, one of the most dynamic ideological trends in the country. Thus, it makes a powerful appeal to a wide range of active citizens, most of whom have had nothing above vague involvement with orthodoxy. It's impossible to achieve any results in today's society within such a wide cast, without such a wide cast appeal. The Kirill's doctrine has been formulated so that the Church could be perceived as a leader, or at least as an ally, by people who neither understand nor want to understand the authentic vocabulary and genuine issues of the Church. Let me talk about couple of specific significant applications of this Kirill doctrine. The Church has frequently advocated for a greater autonomy for ethno-religious communities, all of them facing an unifying pressure from the secular state. Russia is an Orthodox country only in theory. In reality, the Russian Orthodox Church is just one of many organizations dependent on governmental decisions, just like the others, and de facto representing a not so large minority if we consider those who really follow the Church and has close ties to it, and not simply everyone involved with Orthodoxy. Therefore, the Church rhetoric and societal issues oscillates between the national idea grandstanding and the kind of rhetoric typical for representatives of a minority group. In the latter mode, the focus shifts from the unique value of orthodoxy to the need to protect various religious groups, which are portrayed as representing different civilizations. On the other hand, the Church concept of autonomy corresponds to the popular conventional wisdom when in Rome, do as Romans do, applied to ethnic relations. In today's environment of ever-increasing migrant phobia, this saying is used primarily to protect the familiar environment from unusually behaving visitors. It's assumed that at home or among themselves, these strangers have a right to behave in their own ways. So the Kirill's doctrine is once again consistent with the mood of majority, even when it overtly caring about minority rights. The Russian Orthodox Church has also demonstrated a very peculiar approach to the issue of human rights. This subject has been discussed on multiple occasions. I shall only point out several examples. The key church document on this regard, the Russian Orthodox Church Basics Teaching on Human Dignity, Freedom and Rights, starts with stating a rigid connection between human dignity and rights and the absence of sin. But then, without any explanations, abandons this approach. Similarly, these basic teachings put human rights not on par with biblical commandments directly, but with traditional morality, supposedly based on these commandments. This approach is easier for church outsiders to grasp, and the proposed philosophical foundation ends up being wider than the Orthodox faith. Here, the church is obviously looking for a compromise with the notions of secular society. The basic teaching presents the priority of purity of faith and morals over liberty and human rights, not so much as a theological issue, but rather as a metahistorical one, through contraposition of a highly idealized traditional society and the real modern society, with the church siding with the former. As we see, the statements made on behalf of the church deal not so much with faith or even morality, but with the direction of social development. Moreover, this trend implicitly opposes liberal modernization of the country. What audience is being courted by Patriarch Kirill? Thus, we see that the church, in its most important documents, touches not simply the church-going minority, but a much wider social segment. The target group for the Kirill's doctrine can be described as citizens inclined towards some form of Russian nationalism who have not yet developed specific convictions strong enough to make them immune to further arguments. It must be noted that this is a very broad target group. It can include many people who consider themselves neither Russian nor Orthodox, but who share wholly or in part the ideas of Russia's greatness as a nation, the key role of the church in the history, the clash of civilization concept, the evil of liberal innovations, and so on and so forth. The target group in question largely doesn't attend church in any meaningful way. The devout churchgoers, воцерковленные in Russian, are addressed in different manner and for the most part on different issues. Just for example, last March, the Patriarch uttered an important pronouncement against the folk forms of Orthodoxy. Speaking to the select audience that participated in the meal to mark the 35th anniversary of his ordination as archpriest, the Patriarch called on to abandon, I quote, the conservatism inappropriate for a modern person who ties Orthodox Christianity to the practice of the exactly following certain subcultural models, end of quote. It's not clear whether all participants understood the term subculture, but Orthodox churchgoers are in many respects indeed a subculture in Russia or a set of related subcultures. Thus, the Patriarch dared to speak out against the very essence of the social segment that possibly constitutes the core of the church he leads. Apparently, the Patriarch is prepared to a certain degree not to rely on them, or at least to rely not on them only. Thus, the church leadership is trying to appeal simultaneously to two fundamentally different support groups, one inside and one outside of the church fence. Of course, this proverbial fence is not an impenetrable wall, and these groups do communicate with each other. The church leadership also criticizes its two supporters groups, respectively for excessive piety and for insufficient piety. However, neither the churchgoers nor the other side perceive the situation as normal. Neither group is used to the fact that the church steps so far outside of the church fence. Meanwhile, the Kirill's ascension onto the Patriarch throne, this search for expanded audience has intensified dramatically, thus become a focus of sharp criticism both from within the church and from the outside. Internal opposition to the Patriarch Kirill become minimal in the recent couple of years, but in last several months, a sharp and sudden deterioration of relations between the church and the secular liberal-minded part of society, including a large Christian segment, took place in connection with the case of feminist punk band called Pussy Riot. On February 21 this year, this band staged a brief performance in the church's main temple that was described by the performers as a punk prayer, which they called Holy Mother, Blessed Virgin, chase Putin out. The majority of believers perceived the action as a clear blasphemy. 3 band members were soon arrested and incongruously severe criminal charges. Official and semi-official representatives of the church, as well as most supporters of the ruling political party, insist on a strict punishment. Almost all other active groups of society call for the young women's release from prison and for a formulation of the charges. Since this incident took place in the midst of oppositional activity unprecedented in Putin's Russia, in the eyes of the entire society, the church leadership has demonstrated its solidarity with the government. This development greatly increased the extent of public rejection of the program proposed by Patriarch Kirill. So far, primarily focused on the church target audience, but a very noticeable conceptual shift taking place in the course of this propaganda campaign is no less important. This question definitely merits a separate detailed analysis, and here I can only provide some preliminary sketches. On the one hand, the traditional church idiom has always adapted to the non-ecclesiastical language, if only because the church needs the way to refer to non-church realities as well. As a consequence, ecclesiastical terms are used to express notions that fall completely outside of the religious paradigm. For example, here I provide a fragment for the arguments of the above-mentioned Archpriest Vsevolod Chaplin regarding the notion of collective sins. I quote, "There are sins of nations. There are sins of intelligentsia, quite a bit of those, by the way. There is a sin of Russophobia among the intelligentsia. There is a sin of hatred toward everything that symbolizes and supports a strong state. There is a sin of a primitive anarchism." End of quote. Regardless of the substance of Father Vsevolod's remarks, obviously he is not really talking about sins, but rather describes some kind of social phenomena. The ecclesiastical vocabulary is being used here to add weight to the statements, but also in order to legitimize the use of this very vocabulary in public discourse, showing that it can be effectively applied to a variety of non-ecclesiastical subjects. The problem is that these religious notions tend to change their meaning along the way. However, as I said before, this shift of meaning have occurred in the past and are not at all unique to modern Russia conditions. On the other hand, the church language becomes infiltrated with notions that are not just new but inherently problematic and even destructive, I think, for the traditional church paradigm. Here, traditional, I mean the pre-revolutionary church and church of the Soviet era. During the 90s, for example, attempts to obtain special privileges for the church based exclusively on the notion of the special role of Orthodox Christianity in Russia and partly on the need for compensation following the damage inflicted by Soviet regime, failed to achieve any level of success. There are many possible reasons for this failure, but one of them is definitely the government's officials' inability to utilize purely ecclesiastical idiom, while no other vocabulary existed to justify the special treatment for so-called the Church of Majority. However, a significant shift took place in early Putin years when church speakers and writers successfully introduced the concept of the traditional religions, which was very quickly adopted by virtually all senior officials. The notion of traditional, cut off from ecclesiastical reasoning per se, was already acceptable to officials. Among other things, it helped the state to solve a very important in Russia issue, to a discursive separation of loyal Islam from disloyal or insufficiently loyal one. The introduction of the category of traditional religions gradually, by the time of Medvedev's presidency, even entered the legislative framework, which means that the church-affiliated authors of this term achieved a spectacular success. By now, this notion, which clearly undermines orthodoxy's exclusive truth claims, has become firmly entrenched in public utterance of the clergy and in the minds of many in the audience. The church's criterion of the right religion thus becomes split in two. The dogmatic criterion is unfrequently mentioned and retained for internal use, While for the larger group, the Orthodox in the broadest sense of the word, Orthodox Christianity is presented as the right religion for the Russian people, and incidentally some others, for whom it is traditional. The latter interpretation agrees quite naturally with the Kirill's doctrine as a variety of nationalism. I skip something, and the Church statements on the subject of human rights signify perhaps the most obvious shift in the Church language. Despite often idiosyncratic interpretation of human rights in the Church documents and statements, the classic human rights discourse begins to exert reverse influence on the Church language. There even exist Orthodox organizations in Russia now that self-identify as human rights organization, or at least include the human rights protection into their mission statements. As Alexander Agadjanyan correctly notes, the Church is trying to harmonize the human rights approach and the traditional religious worldview, but the results of this attempt are very controversial, largely due to the fact that the authors address two very different audiences simultaneously, the core Orthodox believers and the surrounding secular society. I come to the conclusion. The Kirill's doctrine proposes an identity shift for Russian society, and its direction is very clear. It is a utopian project of partial return to pre-modern society where the Church yields substantial power. The effectiveness of the Church leaders in achieving this goal is not at all self-evident and merits a separate detailed discussion. As in the case of any utopia, attempts to implement this project, at least partially, full implementation is out of the question, leads to development of a completely different direction, strengthening of an authoritarian rule and the Russian nationalism, and further weakening of tentative modernization attempts in all areas. As the Pussy Riot incident demonstrates, in case of an acute conflict with the secularized majority of the active part of the society, the situation causes a crisis of the Church mission per se, and can be fraught with encapsulation of the Church within the narrow circle of churchgoers. However, most likely the current crisis will somehow be overcome, and the Church expansion will continue. We see how the Kirill's doctrine introduces or uses a number of non-traditional concepts and discursive practices, and thus increasingly appeals not to its traditional audience of churchgoers, but those simply interested in the opinion of the Church. It might be too early to make pronouncements regarding the effect of this outreach on the Church itself and the experience of being Orthodox in Russia, but if we assume that the Church has plans to further expansion, to further engage more people in certain religious practices, how will these new people understand their orthodoxy? However, many people sympathetic to the Church, they become familiar with its position not through their parish priest, if they have one at all, or through a sermon, but not from spiritual elders, not from their milieu, but after reading or hearing Patriarch Kirill or Archpriest Всеволод Chaplin or some others, church writers and speakers, such introduction carries a different set of ideas expressed in a different language than, for example, the church communication with long-time parishioners. Patriarch Kirill may have found the most effective way to change the inevitably conservative church mainstream, not by re-educating the existing flock, but by intentionally blurring the boundaries of this mainstream with appeals to friendly but different segments of the society. The Church is trying to catch up with the rapidly changing Russian society. While offering its values to the society, the Church will inevitably absorb some properties of the latter. Paradoxically, I would say that active anti-modern propaganda leads to modernization of the Church itself, even if in the meantime, of course, this process looks not pleasant, or if its result is far from being guaranteed, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well for your very illuminating approach and analysis. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον κύριο Φερχόφσκι για το τολμηρό και πολύ έτσι κατατοπιστικό
for this very interesting and detailed analysis of the current situation in the Russian Orthodox Church. Let me say that Mr. Verkhovsky presented the Cyril dogma, Patriarch Cyril's dogma regarding the position of the Russian Church, Cyril doctrine, in the position of the Russian Church in the world today, and the consequences of this doctrine for the relationship of this church with politics and society. He also managed to indicate how society has been affecting the Russian Church through this modernism and sometimes unfortunate consequences, but which will be very important for the future of the Russian Church. Now, I would like to announce that if there is anyone who would like to receive a diploma proving their participation in this conference, should address themselves to the Secretariat. Now, we will have the presentation by the director of the Volos Academy of Theological Studies, Dr. Pantelis Kalaitsidis. He studied theology in Thessaloniki and philosophy in Paris, in Sorbonne, where he received his MA in 1986. His doctoral thesis in 2008 deals with the issue of Greekness and anti-Westernism in the Greek theology in the 60s. He has published articles in Greek, French, English, German, Serbian, Russian, Belarusian, and Arabic. On his initial field of specialization, which was the comparative study between Eastern Orthodox and Western tradition, and also on his current areas of research interest, the eschatological dimension of Christianity, the dialogue between Orthodox Christianity and modernity, theology and modern literature, religion and multiculturalism, religious nationalism and fundamentalism in an Orthodox context, etc. He is a visiting scholar at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Boston and at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Since 2000, he is the director of the Volos Academy of the Theological Studies, and he has been teaching at the Hellenic Open University. His latest book is titled Orthodox Christianity and Modernity, an Introduction. He has been published recently in a translation in Romanian, and an English translation is also being prepared. The presentation of Mr. Kalaitsidis today is Ecclesiology and Globalization in search of ecclesiological models relevant to the time of globalization after the previous contextual models, local, imperial, and national. He has asked me to give him some 7-10 minutes more, and I think I will be able to grant this demand, given that the previous speakers finished a little bit earlier. Dr. Kalaitsidis. Thank you very much. Your Eminence of Pergamon, Your Eminence of Dimitriada, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Volos Academy of Theological Studies. This will be the last presentation. Of course, I do not pretend to close the debate or to provide you with a summary of this entire conference. But I will make the final presentation on the issue of the relationship between ecclesiology and globalization. To begin with, I will provide some commentary on an article by Father Schmemann. He wrote this article after the granting of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in America, the formerly known as Metropolia. The title was Turmoil with Much Interest. He defines 3 contextual models, 3 traditions, the local, the imperial, and the national context. He makes the relation between these 3 contexts and with the specific types of relation between church and state. The local context is the context we had before Emperor Constantine and having the first Christian communities who were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. The imperial context is the one we find in the Roman and afterwards the Byzantine Empire. And finally, the national context is the one appearing after the appearance of nationalisms, the Enlightenment, and the creation of national states. According to Schmemann, the first context is characterized by the ecclesiology of a local church, the interdependence between the local dioceses, without any of these dioceses being submitted to the jurisdiction of another one. There is a strong interdependence between these churches, but according to Schmemann, this is not of jurisdictional character. It is a unity in tradition and in the Holy Spirit. In that ancient ecclesiological tradition, the initial reference was being made to the local church, that is, the clergy and the congregation that was gathered around a bishop, which was a church in whole, and not submitted to some other type of body, such as a patriarchate or autocephalous church, etc. This does not, he says, mean that there was no primacy or that there was no order or hierarchy. But, according to Schmemann, the existence of order and primacy does not necessarily mean jurisdictional submission or organization. He reminds us of the 34th Apostolic Canon. The bishops of all peoples should know the first among them and recognize him as the head. And he says that the primacy referred to by the 34th Canon is a primacy in the Holy Trinity, an existence of order but not of submission. Therefore, according to Schmemann, the meaning of this primacy is to express the unity of everyone and express everyone's beliefs in unity. After the on the local context, we have the first Christian communities being organized in dioceses and then metropolises and diocesan synods. On a second level, the second context, we have larger geographical areas, the East, Antiochia, Asia, Galatia, and all that. Schmemann says that the churches of a specific area are expecting guidance from the church that had guided them in times of crisis and expect from that church to lead them in the resolution of their problems. And the third context is the imperial one, the national one, that is linked to an ecumenical primacy which started from Jerusalem that later on was moved to the Church of Rome. This initial paradigm of interdependence of the first Christian communities was complicated when the Church created a symphonia, found a more strong relationship with the Byzantine Empire. It seems that Schmemann is much more Byzantine or Hellenist because he makes a very important for us remark. He says that the fact that the church was integrated into the Byzantine Empire, that creation of the second level, the imperial level, as he says, that was the result of this integration, is not an accidental event from an Orthodox point of view. It is a fact inextricably linked to our tradition. So, according to Schmemann, the Orthodox Church cannot do away with the Byzantium without doing away of its own essence. The first ecclesiological paradigm expresses the very essence of the church, whereas the second one, the imperial one, expresses the history of the church and its relationship with the world, However, the Church is in the world but not of the world. Therefore, Schmemann says that the first paradigm refers to what is invariable, and the second one refers to what is variable and might change. Schmemann says that as long as there is the historical reality of the existence of an imperium, the Church does not only accept this fact as de facto, but also creates an organic relation with the imperium. According to Schmemann, this second paradigm, this second context, the imperial one, is at the root of the jurisdictional ecclesiology. This is what led to the systematization of jurisdictional ecclesiology and the creation of hierarchy of in the clergy from the patriarch, the metropolitan, the archbishop, the bishop, etc. This jurisdictional level is totally justified, needed, and has proved itself, but should not be. But we should really make the distinction between this level and the Church itself, which is not of the world. He gives an enlightening example, the fact that the Church is integrated in the organizational structure of the Byzantine Empire is exemplified by, according to Schmemann, by the fact that the Patriarchate of Constantinople was functioning as an ecumenical patriarch, that is, he says, an imperial patriarch. This should not lead us to the conclusion that Schmemann is against the primacy of the ecumenical patriarchate. He says, and I quote, "Personally, I have been defending the ecumenical patriarch's primacy. Therefore, I can't really accept the accusation that I'm against the patriarchate." Let me once more say that I respect this primacy, but in order for that primacy to regain its former important role, we have to clear it of any nationalist aspects of any element that is not truly an element of the Church. And that last remark will bring us to the third level, the third context, the national context. This ecclesiological context is not linked neither to the local church nor to the imperial church. It was forged by a new reality after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and, of course, under the influence of outside forces such as the Enlightenment. It is the creation of a Christian nation, as he says, and which created a new dimension, but also new complications for Orthodox ecclesiology. All the previous speakers have given us an extensive analysis of the history of how we got to that point. And also Schmemann gives us very clear ideas and analysis regarding that. And now I will quote Schmemann. This process led to the creation of the concept of Christian nation that has an identity in front of God. What is interesting for us is to see how the concept of autocephaly was created. Initially, the concept of autocephaly was used circumstantially with various interpretations. Initially, it was used on the basis of a national phenomenon and not in a jurisdictional manner. Therefore, Schmemann says the concept of autocephaly is neither theological nor ecclesiological. According to the Byzantium conception, the empire has an ecumenical church which has its center in Constantinople. When we move to a model of national states, we need autocephaly as a concept. That is, autocephaly, which is an ecclesiological independence, becomes the symbol of national and political independence. Isn't it interesting to note that all the negotiations regarding autocephaly were being conducted not by the churches but by the states? And I think the most typical example, says Schmemann, is the example of the autocephaly of the Russian Church, a process during which the Russian Church itself did not participate. And Schmemann says that this new form of autocephalous church, as it appeared in Bulgaria and later Russia and Serbia, is not just jurisdictional. The main consequence of this concept is not so much jurisdictional, it is rather a national concept. It is a way of conceiving the church as an expression of national identity. He does not necessarily, Schmemann does not necessarily condemn the concept because of that. But according to him, the history of Orthodox East shows that the Orthodox nation is not only a reality, but also a, so to speak, success, because he says there was a true birth in Christ, the creation and resurgent of a national church at the time where the imperial church was declining. So in conclusion, Schmemann says that what is unjustified is to confuse between this historical development with ecclesiology, and when that happened, that was the beginning of an ecclesiological fall. Schmemann continues his analysis about the reactions to the autocephaly that was granted to by the Russian Church to the Orthodox Church in America. He is severely critical towards these Greek Orthodox people who have been so much in need of the Byzantium, of the empire, of the Byzantine theocracy, and the role of the Constantinople Patriarchate operating within the system of the Millet. So regardless of whether one is in favor or against Schmemann's analysis, I think that it is obvious that Schmemann was writing inside a multicultural society in America and could not foresee the developments of globalization and modernity. However, he presents three contexts, three models of our ecclesiological tradition, that is the local, imperial, and national context. He is highly critical of the national context. He also is very critical of the fusion between the imperial and national context. However, he does not, let me remind you that he died in 1983, he could not really analyze the rapid developments that were taking place in America in the 70s. For us today, however, who live this challenge of globalization, we see all these migrations of people, the osmosis between cultures and religions, we are able to see the challenges that face the Church today, the challenges to our ecclesiology, and the challenges to our discussion. Diversity today is national, racial, religious, ideological, social, based on age, etc. That has led to the disappearance of a homogeneous space for religion to flourish. We are witnessing and the IT revolution, great geopolitical developments, and large movements of people. So the demand for religious tolerance and the dialogue between civilizations is imperative. Of course, we should avoiding the danger of religious syncretism. We are moving from a liquid modernity towards one and only identity expressed through multiple identities. Modern societies need to be open societies, and this has consequences for the role of the Church in these societies, and also consequences for our ecclesiology and the ecclesiological context or paradigm that we are going to develop in this globalized age. Us Orthodox people have not started a debate on all these issues. We have kept seeking for answers from the past. We Orthodox have been so much identified with the Byzantine Empire that the fall of the empire in 1453 seems to have created a trauma that we have never been able to heal. We still feel orphans. We are unable to manage this trauma. We are unable to find our pace and something beyond the existence of imperiums or divine right monarchies. We are nostalgic of the 19th century when the great powers created Balkan monarchies, Balkan kingdoms. We created messianic expectations of these Balkan kingdoms. On an ecclesiological level, the Orthodox seem to be locked into the pentarchy system that was operative in the context of the multinational Byzantine Empire that presupposed the existence of the 5 great imperial centers of Old Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antiochia, and Jerusalem. Some will add the autocephalous Church of Cyprus, whereas some others would replace ancient Old Rome with the Church of Russia, the Church of Russia barely hiding its ambition to become the Third Rome. The same people who take for granted the system of pentarchy are very often the same people who take for granted this fragmentalization of orthodoxy in various national churches, sometimes fighting between them. And this is a clear negation of of everything preached by the Orthodox representatives when they meet in their ecumenical councils. I do not have the ambition to define the ecclesiological paradigm in an age of globalization in a short presentation here. I just want to give some indications of what this post-national ecclesiology could look like. This is why I will not repeat all the very important aspects that Dr. Paul Meindorf or Father Papathomas or the Metropolitan of Pergamos gave us all these days, especially regarding the fact that we will reach a dead end when it comes to national jurisdictions in diaspora and the principle of territoriality. But let me try to continue the debate put forward by His Eminence when he asked whether a fall or a disappearance of the concept of nationalism in the globalized world would lead to the disappearance of the concept of autocephaly. We theologists very often create some wonderful analysis We say, for example, that the Church creates a sacramental union in which race, language, culture, etc. play no role. We often say, we theologists, that the Church is a new nation that is not identified with any other nation existing on earth, because the links, the connections between us, between the members of the Church, are not blood links. They are rather the links created by our communion in the body of Christ. We also refer to a new Israel, to a new chosen people, to a third genus, neither Jews nor Greeks, because all Christians are the genus of the Lord Jesus Christ. Or, as Florovsky has said, after Christ there is only one nation, the Christian nation, genus Christianum, that is the Church, the only people of God. No other nationality, no other nation can ask for this place according to the Bible. How can we translate all that in our current ecclesiological context? Are we the third genus? Or are we putting much more importance in our national identity, and that national identity is affecting our stance regarding ecclesiological matters? Can the Church be identified with one single nation and try to further this nation's objectives? And these objectives, is it possible to force the eschatological dimension to the background? Shouldn't we recognize that precisely because of eschatology, which creates a different system of values, this is the reason why all these national objectives are not so important anymore? St. Gregory has written that for everyone who is learned, there is only one homeland, Jerusalem, because we live in temporary homelands. We sojourn in them, and that was from his epistle to Arians. I'm not talking about the disappearance of the concept of nation. That would be the end of history. But we need to debate about this issue right from today. Even if eschatology is linked to the second coming, we need to start right from today transcending the concept of nations in the Church. We need to do this gradually, and I believe this should be reflected both on the Church's structure and on the ecclesiological context or paradigm. So we need to ask how compatible is the current ecclesiological structure, the structure based on autocephaly, with the eschatological nature and identity of the Church. Many historians refer to imaginary communities, as Anderson said. They talk about the construction of these identities. And it is a historical fact that now we are witnessing mixture, coming together of various nations and various cultures in multicultural societies. So the question is, what will the Orthodox Church do in this context? even without accepting the fact that the national identity might be an imagined identity, can we continue to disregard the reality of multicultural societies? For example, the Orthodox Church in Greece, does it refer only to Greeks or also to any Orthodox person who is currently living in Greece? And that was just an example that might go as well for other churches in other regions. So, is there an identification between the Orthodox Church in Greece with a Greek Orthodox Church? Shouldn't we follow the principle of territoriality, having all Orthodox people in a specific region participate and being members of one church, instead of making a distinction and discrimination based on national, ethnic, or other factors? Is the church national or is it local? Is it joining, uniting people, or is it dividing them on the basis of ethno-national identity or linguistic identity? So, continuing from Schmemann, should we create and talk about a fourth context after the local, imperial and national ones? Because what we are currently experiencing is a hybrid and unnatural combination of the imperial and national context that is in contrast with current ecclesiological and political reality. We need to remember the 17th canon of the Chalcedon Council in order to explain current practice in the Church, following the political developments and the political structures created by them. In my opinion, this canon does not only create a relationship between the Church and the political developments. I personally believe that this canon proposes the concept of annexation. But I would rather pose the question of what this canon means in a globalized world, with all the migration waves we're witnessing today. Or also in the context of a European Union that will be the region in which I will focus. Many of what we are discussing now is very much linked to what will happen to the European integration. The current crisis and the German conservatism might lead to a failure of the effort to unite Europe. But maybe some genuinely pro-European forces will revive the European vision, make it more human, provide hope to people and to the nations. Perhaps we may witness that, and we may witness a new Europe that will not, that will be truly integrated and will respect the diversity, whether that is cultural, religious, or other. If European institutions are reinforced, if we manage to go this way, in that case, following the rule that says that the Church should be following the political developments will lead us to a completely new reality, to a completely new type of organization of the Church. But a prerequisite for all that is for everyone to stop considering Orthodoxy as a purely Balkan identity, to view Europe as an opportunity, not as a threat, and to see beyond the mere opening of branch offices of Orthodox churches in Brussels. In 1985, in Greece, just 4 years after our entering the European Economic Community, Ioannis Zisioulas, the current Metropolitan of Pergamon, had written an article very much in favor of the European future of Orthodoxy, a European future for Hellenism in general. In several traditional European countries such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, or Ukraine, or even Russia and Belarus, I see similar views expressed by several Orthodox priests and thinkers. So we might even pose the question of how much the development of the ecclesiological paradigm will be affected by the European integration and the European perspective of these countries. I believe in the principle of linking the ecclesiological developments to political developments. We need to view a supranational perspective, which is expressed today by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Ecumenical Patriarchate being much more closer to the spirit of Orthodoxy and much more compatible to the process of globalization. Historians and sociologists have frequently said that the creation of nationalist sentiment is linked to a suppression of national sentiment. If we move from the political and national field to the church and the ecclesiological one, after criticizing the obvious instrumentalization of Orthodoxy in the past and in the forging of national identities, we will inevitably be led to pose the following question. Asking for autocephaly was perhaps inevitable right after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, but today, isn't it perhaps the time for all of us to review the position of the Church in the new political context created by a gradual integration of Orthodox nations inside the European Union? Or in other words, after gaining our national revival, after making the mistake of linking Orthodoxy and nationalism, isn't it perhaps the time, hasn't perhaps the time come for us to review our position and touch the previously taboo issue of autocephaly as well? Because otherwise, we will have to wonder where the limit of granting autocephaly will be set. We will be having even more and more demands for autocephaly. And that in a context, a political context that goes directly in the opposite direction, into the direction of globalization. We have politically a globalization and ecclesiologically a Balkanization. So, following Schmemann's analysis, the first level is usually the diocese, that is, land in which all bishops, along with the Metropolitan, participate in the ordainment of bishops and have a biannual synod. Now, if we were to grant autocephaly, according to the ancient tradition, it would be correct to grant autocephaly at this level. I'm not an expert in canon law, but perhaps I would say that this is why the Church of Cyprus was granted autocephaly so early. But certainly, that autocephaly was not granted to recognize a nation and certainly not a new state. As I said, I'm not in a position to propose a new ecclesiological paradigm myself or to resolve the issue of the diaspora myself. However, I believe that any solution will have to base itself on what we've learned from the mistakes of the past, but most importantly, should need to take into consideration and respect the core of the Gospel's teachings. Otherwise, us Orthodox will not see better days. We need to debate ecclesiologically in depth all these issues, but we need to be self-critical, we need to repent, and we need to throw away all national or state objectives. We need to transcend our previous mistakes. I wouldn't want to speak about others, but regarding the Greeks, we need to stop considering that we are the chosen people. We need to stop confusing between the history of our Lord and the history of our national revival. In the current context, I believe that the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which has a long tradition of ecumenicity, of a universality, which is a church that is neither national nor state-based, in this context, I believe that the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople is unique, is terribly important, provided that its representatives will put ecumenism first and Hellenism second, that the Christian ecumenism will take advantage over Hellenic concerns. Thank you, Mr. Kalaitzidis, for this very extensive analysis of the question. And although you said that you did not have the, you couldn't propose by yourself a complete proposal, I think we will all agree that you gave us food for thought.
So as not to waste our time, because we have already exceeded the time limit, I think we should move with the discussion. How much time do we have? We have half an hour, right? I would like to ask you, so as to have as many comments as possible. I want you to be as brief as possible. Rather, it's better to have questions rather than comments, and they should range at around 2 minutes. It's difficult to focus, to identify which is the most interesting thing of what you said. I will merely just pose another dimension. Here in Wolu, I read the book that you published recently on the theology of liberation, and I was having the following thought. It's not just the hegemonic position of Germany, but rather today's empire is the empire of money, which wants to flatten the nations for financial interests. So just as the theology of liberation could speak against the loan sharks, and we could also include here a constitutional or a democratic patriotism. This could also be integrated into this theology of liberation against all those who want to subsume the nations. That's my question.
Father Lawrence from Australia. I just wanted to present an image first and then a question. it seems to me that in all this discussion, there's a very brutal expression of our saviours that applies, and it is, the dog goes back to its vomit. In that, yeah. And it seems to me that nationalism has been, and the temptation to ally the church with power has been a constant temptation, not just in the Orthodox East, but also in the Latin West. So, and it reminds me of an interview which takes place in a play written by John Osborne called Luther, and in the play Luther, Martin Luther is interviewed by Cardinal Cajetan, representing the Roman Church, and Cajetan accuses Luther of something. He says, "Once I was a Christian man, speaking Latin, and at home in all cultures and nations." Words to this effect. "But because of you, there are now borders, there are now guard posts, there are now passports and separation." And in a way, that's the Christian tragedy. And now, having run after the idols of nationalism, we've now got the project of trying to recreate ourselves and do something useful for man. Now, that was an image. The question I would like to address to both speakers is this. What do we do, for example, with Pope John Paul II's expression, which he used many, many times, putting aside his personality, just concentrate on the expression, about the churches, East and West, breathing with both lungs? And it seems to me that indicates that Europe, and for that matter the world, is no longer a Catholic project or an Orthodox project, but rather it's a project for both lungs of Christianity. And the ecumenical dimension, I think, in this discussion is absolutely fundamental. And without it, we'll be going, as the Lord said, back to our vomit.
I have a question for Pantelis Kalaitsidis. Thinking of the phrase of the late Elis Kopetea, who said that the Greeks, since Korais, we suffer from double vision. We see ourselves through the eyes of the others, that is, the Europeans or whoever. We refer to Anderson, who speaks about nationalism as an imaginary community. But postmodernity is also an imaginary community. It's not something given. It's considered given only by the spin doctors. Postmodernity is a form of consumerism. So if we take it as granted, then we will not be able to explain its role. If we see it as something deterministic, if we see it as something authentic, then we won't be able to criticize it from an Orthodox perspective. How can you find your place in this postmodern ocean? Thank you. First of all, I want to thank both speakers, and I will address especially Pantelis. What you formulated in your own presentation was a very appealing demand, and I don't think that we will disagree with that. What I want to add is that in my own personal contribution, I tried to show that if we study the most extreme opponents of the nation, such as Kellner, or the most extreme friends of the nation, such as Smith, or the most radical comments with regard to the morbid construction of identity by Lacan, in all cases we see that the nation does exist. It is something that resists, so we should not fall into the trap of ecclesiological transcendentalism. Why does the nation resist? Because there is a mechanism at work in the collective unconscious that is transforming the ecclesiological fact into an element of national identity. So we need an elaborated ecclesiology that will be able to move us gradually away from that. Because, as was said before, the future groupings at the historical level may function in a similar way. So the question should be critical also towards the coming ecumenism. Our ecclesiological work is not over when we opt for Catholicity, but we also have to examine the quality of Catholicity and whether it is able to save the reality of historical formation and also the possibility of exiting their limitations. All the presentations in the conference were very interesting, but the two last posed many questions. My proposal to the two speakers is the following. Today, organizations such as the UN are shaping a policy through their member states, and the Church cannot ignore that reality. And in order to be ecumenical, the Church must also influence the persons who participate in these venues. So apart from praying, we also try to exert moral pressure in the direction of social justice. So maybe His Eminence of Pergamon is the most suitable for speaking about that. When we engage in dialogue with Roman Catholics, our intention was to see how the Church protected its unity for 1,000 years, and in that framework to protect the current course of unity in our Church in order to change the world. And we have been accused, of course. My final proposal is the following. How can we create a framework so that the memoranda can be submitted to the right persons and we can move ahead through dialogue? And we should also be inspired from the past, because without the past we will not be able to work in the present. Mr. Βασιλιάδης.
Θα μιλήσω αγγλικά γιατί απευθύνομαι στον συνάδελφο τον Alexander. I will speak in English because I would like to ask you to give us a clarification of your reading of Patriarch Kirill's policy. Patriarch Kirill is the same religious leader who signed all the messages of the primates of the Orthodox Church, where a non-nationalistic perspective is underlined. I understand that, of course, Father Chaplain, you mentioned, and others, and through the media, we receive an idea that something very pre-modern is underway in Russia. But my question is that is it because he wants, and the Church wants to lead the nation towards a specific direction, or because they want in addition to the so-called human rights, they want to present, in addition, the human responsibilities or the human dignity. These are the terminology they normally use. So this is, there is my dissatisfaction that I don't want here in Greece to make such a strong criticism for the Russian policy, ecclesiastical policy. Τώρα η κύρια ερώτηση.
Now my main question to Pantelis Kalaitsidis. It has to do with the comments that we have just heard. Most comments focus on nationalism and not to ecclesiology. If our criterion and our norm is the ancient church tradition, and Schmemann and others point out to that direction. So my question is, our preoccupation with the beginnings of ecclesiology, και είμαι εναντίον της διάκρισης ανάμεσα σε ανατολική και δυτική θρησκεία. I am in favor of the view that we should talk about the church, the single church, as Father Nikolaos said, in a proper theological perspective.
Προσπαθούμε να αμφισβητήσουμε όλη αυτή την επαναφορά.
But to try to question this return to old ecclesiology based on the ambitions that we may have about nations and nationalism, this creates a sort of disorientation. Thank you.
Να ευχαριστήσω και εγώ προσωπικά και τους
I want to thank on my part both speakers. I have been already covered by Father Nikolaos when he tried to link the Catholicity with the new facts that Pantelis proposed that arise out of the geopolitical changes that we face today. In this sense, I would like to thank personally Pantelis precisely because he treated some issues that are really urgent. And his perspective is quite innovative, and I agree with what with the fact that he moved along the lines opened by His Eminence of Pergamon, but he was a little hesitant. Let me mention a criticism here, precisely because things are urgent. We have to consider them immediately and soon. So I'm personally concerned because I have lived half of my life abroad, and I see that the developments are already ahead of us. Pantelis has already highlighted these developments, and I want to submit to him a question. Are we Orthodox afraid of nationalism? What is our problem? Because we have created under a climate of state nationalism in the last 2 centuries, so nationalism has become a taboo. So maybe we have a fear with regard to nationalism, or is it a deficiency on our part so as to be able to confront nationalism and to move ahead? And Mr. Skaslari, this will be the last question. My question is addressed to Mr. Verhofsky. What are the most important critical voices in the Russian Church with regard to this main line represented by the Patriarch Cyril? Θα προσπαθήσω να είμαι σύντομος.
May maybe the most simple question is the last one about critical voices. I would say that the critical voices are very weak, so they are not important if we look outside, from outside the church. They're not heard by the society, and they are rather weak in the church. The most serious critics from inside the church is the critics from fundamentalist groups. So when I talk about Patriarch Kirill and his opinions, I always have in mind that he has to seek also a compromise with these internal fundamentalist critics, which are rather powerful. Then about your question about positive things, let's say. Of course, in the basics of social concept of Russian Orthodox Church, nationalism is rejected, but it's more some misunderstanding, because in Russian usual language, common language, which used by the church authors, nationalism means only some aggressive forms of ethnic xenophobia. It's not the same term which is used in political science. What Patriarch Kirill and his followers they create some specific form of nationalism suggested to the society and to other nationalists, and there is a kind of political competition there. As to this document on human rights and dignity, of course, it's important that Church talks about human rights and dignity and Christian dignity of the personality of the person, but the way how this certain document does it is, I would say, very preliminary. It's like people first time try to talk about something very new for them. I understand. I saw how it was done. It's a pity, but now the Church cannot make a serious impact to this real discussion on human rights issues in Russia. But it's important for the Church and very good for the Church that it starts to participate in this discussion. There may now maybe it's minimal impact, but it will be. And the last thing about two lengths. It opens maybe a very long topic about relationships between Russian Orthodox Church and Roman Catholic Church. But what we see in general, that again, in very general, on the one hand, some anti-Catholic sentiments are basic for self-identification of Russian nationalism. It's a very important part. It's very difficult to exclude it, even if it's not mentioned sometimes. But on the other hand, there is a cooperation between Russian Orthodox Church and Roman Catholic Church on the European level, in UN, again, and somewhere else, for some anti-secular, let's say, initiatives. But if to look from the perspective of ideology, it may be the same, because this anti-secularism is a part of anti-Westernism for Russian nationalism. And it is one of features of this nationalism. So it serves for the same. Initiatives themselves may be better or worse. It depends. But anyway, it's in the same framework.
Okay, thank you.
I will be very brief. Thank you for the comments and the questions. I will not comment on the comments because we don't have enough time. I will just say a few things about some criticisms and the questions. I don't remember your name. To Mr. Thomaidis, since you referred to this book, I will say a few words. The Biblical Theology of Liberation. If you noticed, my in my text, among the various forms of liberation theology that I present also this version that you highlighted, national liberation. But the question that I pose in the book is why in Orthodoxy we have kept only this form of liberation theology, which is even not basic for the Gospels. And to respond also to other criticisms, I will mention a phrase of Father Gregory. There is a fear. It's not a fear of nationalism, but it's a fear of not losing, or it's a fear of losing our identity. In this presentation, I did not refer very much to nationalism. I mostly focused on ecclesiology. I borrowed Schmemann's analysis. And I don't think I spoke very much about nationalism. I just mentioned nationalism as a factor of division in the ecclesiological level. I'm afraid that we are very sensitive with regard to this issue. I just mentioned Anderson in passing. I just said there is this theory. I didn't even say my opinion about the theory. But there is a reality that we cannot neglect, we cannot refuse. I don't understand why we are so sensitive about that. Today we are not talking about nationalism, we are talking about ecclesiology. So can the Church continue to function as a confederation of national churches? That is the question. I agree with the comment of Father Ludovicos. We should be critical about the future. Of course, we are not accepting as it is, but we also should not close our eyes, shut our eyes in front of reality. We don't like reality. We Orthodox like to flee reality to an ideal dimension. With regard to Father Gregory, I was not exactly hesitant. It's just that as a non-expert, I didn't focus on issues that I'm not very familiar with. You are a professor of canon law, so you're more experienced on such issues. And I absolutely agree that this matter is urgent. And I am afraid that things are moving very fast. I'm saying again that I will not comment on the comments because we don't have enough time. Of course, comments are always legitimate, and I'm sure there are mistakes and problems in my presentation. Before we conclude, Mr. Kalaitsidis will make a brief presentation of the new book that has already been mentioned by the audience, and then we will end the session and the conference. Yesterday, I didn't want to mix everything together. I made a very brief presentation of the two English books of the series that we have begun with the World Council of Churches. But I also want to inform you about the last book, the latest book of the Academy, which is entitled Biblical Theology of Liberation. It is the fruit of an international seminar held here in May 2009 in cooperation with the Heidelberg University and the Thessaloniki Department of Theology. It includes the texts of the presentations. It has my own presentation entitled Orthodoxy and Political Theology. It is an introduction which poses the framework of the discussion. Then there are three texts about the biblical theology of liberation by Mr. Vasiliadis, among others, and by Dimitris Passakos. Then there is a very interesting text by Thanasis Papathanasiou on the perspectives of patristic thought in the theology of liberation. And then there are three other texts which are moving in an ecumenical direction by Christos Tsironis, by Stelios Tsopanidis, and by Ulrich Dukru, who had the initial idea about the seminar. All of these three texts pose the discussion at an ecumenical, inter-Christian levels and refer to this whole issue of alternative globalization, which is supported by some Christians. It is published by Invictus, and we would very much like to hear your opinions and views and your criticisms about the book. Also, I want to thank the co-organizers of this very important conference, about the speakers who worked very hard on their presentations and who had to travel here, all the collaborators of the Academy and of the Conference Center who supported us in the organization of this conference, the chairs of the sessions, who helped us with the procedure. Also, I want to thank the interpreters. Thank you. Who helped us to communicate with each other and to overcome the linguistic obstacles and boundaries. And am I forgetting anybody? And of course, His Eminence Metropolitan of Demetrios for his support to this endeavor. And finally, a warm applause for all of you for your presence here and for your help throughout these years.
Now, His Eminence will declare the end of the conference. I am not the one who will declare the end of the conference, but on my part, I would also like to thank everyone. First of all, His Eminence, the Metropolitan Ioannis of Pergamon, who is also representing His All Holiness, Divine Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Bartholomew. We had our Eucharist today and the ordinance today, and I've repeatedly said that he is a person supporting our efforts and endeavors for many years now, and we have all, I think, known that this road has not been a bed of roses. It has had many difficulties. There is criticism we are facing, sometimes good-willing criticism, sometimes not so much. But this debate, this discussion shows that there is something moving and is, in my opinion, important. I would also like to thank the members of the board of directors of the Academy, Wolu's Academy of Theological Studies. You know their names, you know how much they work, and from the bottom of my heart, I feel that they are the ones supporting me, even if they say that I am the one supporting them. We are together in that effort. And I would also like to thank our director, Dr. Karlaitsidis, who is the soul of this effort. Who, as I've said, all these years have been tolerating each other. I was very attentive throughout the conference, as much as I can, and I really felt that the subject is essential, urgent, truly important for the Orthodox Church. There is just one thing in my heart, that remains. And that's the following, that all these things we are discussing are linked to our own deficiencies, our own inabilities that are expressed through our presence in church. But we should never forget that it is the Holy Spirit in the body of church. And as a bishop, I would, of course, like to see all these problems resolved one day. Still, I feel that the Holy Spirit is guiding us, is leading us to salvation, is helping us witness and teach to our congregation, and is showing us the way in a world that is ever-changing, as has been said. And it is true that there may be problems or deficiencies in the administrative structure of the church, or etc., that are problems that need to be resolved for us to live in communion. But we should not forget that there is there is the patristic aspect, the saint aspect, that gives the church the power to resolve problems. Let us just see the example of how the Orthodox Church in Greece is operating. It is prophetical, because there is not only one way in the way we are organized as Orthodox in Greece. This, I think, is indicative of the fact that there are always solutions to the various problems. Let us praise God for the truth He has bestowed to us. Let us hope that everyone from their own positions and loving our church and with the help of God and the Holy Spirit will lead us in the proper path to union in Christ, a union that will be even more essential, deep. I would like to thank you all for coming here, for participating. We will continue our effort. You all know that there is a financial crisis in Greece, so I will not make any big promises. To my colleagues, to my collaborators, I say that we have to face things as they come. But from my side, I have to promise to you that we will continue our teaching, our preaching, our efforts to transmit the message of the Church and to safeguard things we manage to create. And I would also like to ask the director and the members of the board to give even more importance to the publications work of the Academy. Once more, we took advantage of the Internet to reach out to an audience internationally. This level of communication will be even more enhanced in the future, and we will use even more the Internet. And Your Eminence, I know your views, but here is an example of how much the Internet can be useful. We will also continue to organize at least one conference, international conference per year. And we want to build up on the collaboration with the various co-sponsors that we have already started. And let us hope that even more organizations will participate in our efforts and our interest for theology, ecclesiology, and all the related subjects. This is what I had to say, and I would like to ask His Eminence to bless us. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, Your Eminence, for giving me the opportunity to close this conference. When an important conference comes to its end, it's a new beginning. It's not only an end, it's a beginning. It's a beginning of something new, because otherwise the conference wouldn't have been important. And I am sure that this conference is important precisely because it will be the beginning of something new. Because all the speakers, all the presentations, especially the last one by my dear friend Pandelis, give us food for thought, makes us ponder as members of the Orthodox Church on whether we should question not only our current situation, which is highly problematical, as it has already been demonstrated when we discussed about the diaspora. It is a fact that the current situation of the Church is problematical, very problematical. And we should remain alert, and this is our responsibility to God, our responsibility towards our Church. But beyond that, shouldn't we also think about what lies ahead, the next day? Of course, we should not forget that this is not in our hands. All we can do is estimate, calculate a little bit what might happen in the future based on some indications we might observe. But this, and this is my main remark actually regarding the presentation by Mr. Karlaitsidis, we need to think about, to critically think about the possibility of the disappearance of nation states and the disappearance of national borders. And we need to think about whether this will create a new historical context. A new historical context within which Orthodoxy, drawing upon its tradition, will have to adopt. And I think it might be important to debate and think about whether and what we would do if things were to develop in that direction. But as I already said, we can never be sure about what will happen in the future in history. We cannot control history. Of course, we observe the globalization, but no one knows what will be the end of this road, how humanity will react, how the people will react to what is happening, especially when people see that globalization is a threat to values very dear to their existence. His Eminence referred to a little bit to my position regarding the internet and technology. Well, of course, we have all surrendered to technology and all that, and we are very grateful for the fact that we can transcend geographical boundaries, for the fact that we can broadcast this conference even to the United States, etc. But maybe I'm not the only one who is a little bit questioning these developments. This disappearance of time and place, limits and borders that are part of our nature. Using technology and all these forces, perhaps we are starting to suppress our nature and question our nature. So we can never be sure on whether this postmodern society and era will destroy structures created in the past. We need to prepare for that possibility and discuss issues such as autocephaly, the administrative structure of the Orthodox Church, which are very much linked. Anyway, I wouldn't want to continue and give you a lecture. I just wanted to share some thoughts. But I hope that this conference will be the beginning of us debating and discussing such questions, such issues. And this is why I believe this conference is important. And in closing that conference, and I would like to transmit the gratitude of His all-divine, Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, because he bears a special responsibility, great responsibility about the future of Orthodoxy. So, on his behalf as well, I would like to thank you, Your Eminence, for this conference. Let this conference be the seed in everyone's conscience, in all Orthodox people's conscience. And let us hope that this seed will create something, will create an awareness and debate, because this is what we need to transcend the biggest enemy we have, which is laxism. Thank you very much.